Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Tonight, we lead with Operation Kaveri. It's a rescue operation that the government of India has launched to bring Indians to safety. Violent clashes in the Sudan have claimed more than 400 lives. Around 3,000 Indians are said to be stuck there. We'll tell you about the efforts to bring them home, what they were doing in the Sudan in the first place, and also what triggered this fighting. Meanwhile, a cartoon in a German publication has drawn a sharp reaction from India. A union minister has called it racist and mocking, and we agree. In China, the banking crisis is back in the headlines. There are reports of protests. In Pakistan, there is talk of another military coup. In America, cannabis sales have exceeded chocolate, even egg sales, according to some reports. This is a country that is banning abortion pills but legalizing drugs. What are they smoking, we ask. The headlines first. US President Joe Biden announces his re-election bid. The 80-year-old says he will seek a second term to quote-unquote finish the job. The 2024 elections could pit him once again against 76-year-old Donald Trump, who he defeated in 2020. Biden is already the oldest US president ever. A fiery face-off at the UN. Russia warns the world now, quote-unquote, possibly more dangerous than during the Cold War. Its foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, slams the West, saying it doesn't speak on behalf of all humankind, while the UN chief and Western nations denounce Russia for invading Ukraine. South Korea's president in hot water over his comments on Japan. President Yoon Suk-yeol said Japan need not kneel down to improve ties. From 1910 to 1945, Japan, a colonial power, ruled over the Korean peninsula. Yoon has made boosting relations with Tokyo a top priority. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurates the country's first water metro. He launched the service in Kerala. The Kochi Water Metro will connect 10 islands around the city. It will run on battery-operated electric hybrid boats. And Russia joins the artificial intelligence race. A state-owned company announces the launch of GigaChat to rival ChatGPT. Our lead tonight is Operation Kaveri, a rescue operation launched by the government of India to bring Indians to safety. Thousands of them are caught in the Sudan conflict. We've been telling you about this fighting and what's been happening there. Now, India is pulling out its nationals. Yesterday, 500 Indians were rescued, and in the days ahead, more will be returning home. There's a ceasefire in place now. It was brokered by the United States, and the United Nations is monitoring the situation.
I am in constant contact with the parties to the conflict, and I've called on them to de-escalate tensions and to return to the negotiating table. We will continue our efforts with our partners to secure a permanent halt to the fighting as soon as possible.
The ceasefire comes after 10 days of heavy fighting. It was so bad that Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan, turned into an active war zone. Quick primer. The Sudan is a country in Northeast Africa, one of the largest on the continent, also one of the poorest in the world. It's a predominantly Muslim country and it has been caught in conflict. In 2021, there was a coup in the Sudan. The generals began running the country and now they're fighting for power and control. On one side is General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He leads the Sudanese army. He's also the de facto president. On the other side is General Mohammad Hamdan Dagalo. He heads a paramilitary force called the RSF, the Rapid Support Force, RSF. Now, the RSF has close to 100,000 members. The debate is over who controls them and essentially who leads the country. And these two generals were once friends and allies. Together, they toppled a dictator just 2 years ago, and now they're fighting each other for power. The clashes began on the 15th of April. More than 400 people have been killed so far. At least one of them is said to be an Indian. There have been multiple attempts to stop the fighting. This is the fourth ceasefire announcement. The previous three in the last 10 days, were unsuccessful. What about this one? For the moment it's holding. They've declared a 72-hour-long truce. It's a narrow window to carry out evacuations, and it's a tricky and dangerous setting. New Delhi is attempting a daring rescue of Indians. How many of them are there? Close to 3,000 Indians are said to be in the Sudan. They're stranded across the country, and India is using all possible channels to rescue them. In the initial days, India relied on allies. Saudi Arabia and France pulled out some Indian nationals. We told you about this yesterday too. Saudi Arabia rescued 3 Indians. France rescued another 5. But many more remain stuck. So India has now deployed its own assets to get them out. This week, India moved 2 military aircraft and 1 naval ship for the operation. The ship, called INS Sumeda, is docked at Port Sudan. Port Sudan is some 850 kilometers from the capital, Khartoum, and the capital is the current battleground. It's also where most people are stranded. The plan is to get Indian nationals to Port Sudan, to get them to board the ship and to bring them home. Here's what Prime Minister Modi said about the operation.
सूडान में गृह युद्ध के कारण हमारे अनेकों देशवासी फंसे हैं। हमने ऑपरेशन कावेरी का अभियान शुरू किया है और वहां से हमारे लोगों को सुरक्षित लाने का काम प्रारंभ हो चुका है और उसकी निगरानी के लिए हमारी केरल की ही संतान और मेरी सरकार के मंत्री मुरलीधरन जी को मैं उसकी निगरानी के लिए वहां भेज रहा हूं ताकि ऑपरेशन कावेरी बहुत तेज गति से हम सफलतापूर्वक पूर्ण करें।
Why call it Operation Kaveri? Well, Kaveri is an Indian river. It flows through 2 southern states, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And it so happens that a lot of the Indians stuck in the Sudan belong to the state of Karnataka, hence the name Operation Kaveri. Apparently, the Prime Minister himself chose this name. And this is not the first time that India has named a rescue mission after a river. Last year, remember, when the war in Ukraine began, India launched Operation Ganga. Ganga, as you would know, is another major Indian river, and the rescue operation from Ukraine was named after it. But this time, there's a political debate over the name and the operation itself. The state of Karnataka is going to the polls next month. It's a high-stakes battle between the ruling BJP and the opposition Congress party. Now, critics say the government is politicizing the rescue effort and that the name Kaveri is aimed at attracting voters in Karnataka. The government, on its part, has slammed the attempt to play politics on a rescue mission. Now, we don't want to dwell on the politics, so we leave it at that. Let's instead focus on another aspect of this story. What were all these people doing in the Sudan? Why were some 3,000 Indians there in the first place? A lot of you may not be aware of this, but India-Sudan connection dates back some 150 years. Some members of the Indian community have lived in the Sudan for decades. The first Indian to visit the Sudan was said to be a Gujarati, a trader who traveled to Sudan from Aden in the year 1856. Once there, he got his friends and family to join him. The community grew. Today, it has some 1,200 Indians. They live there. Then there were those who went to work. Some 2,500 to 3,000 Indian citizens work in different sectors of the Sudanese economy. Some are employed with local UN missions. And India itself has had deep interest in West Africa. In the 1950s, India helped the Sudan organize its first general elections. India's election commission was involved in the effort. And that's not all. Indian engineers helped in setting up the local railway network. Also the sugar factories. Experts say India also played an important role in the birth of South Sudan. It's a separate country. It was created more than a decade back, and its creation ended a civil war that had dragged for almost 50 years. India was one of the first countries to open a consulate in South Sudan. In the year 2011, India recognized the government of South Sudan. In 2016, India carried out a similar rescue mission there. Clashes had broken out in South Sudan, and India rescued its citizens from there. So this is not new territory for India or for Indians. They remain engaged in the region largely because of the oil reserves in the Sudan. Indian companies hold stakes across energy assets and blocks. So any conflict in the Sudan impacts India in more ways than one. The immediate priority, of course, is to bring Indians to safety, but India should not hesitate in stepping up, in engaging with all its partners and ensuring that the ceasefire leads to a permanent truce. A good cartoon is like a stinging editorial, except more concise. It uses pictures to evoke thought, to expose double standards. But sometimes the cartoon itself is a double standard. Let me show you. This cartoon appeared on a German magazine called Der Spiegel. It means the mirror in German, Der Spiegel. On this occasion, a foggy and broken mirror. The subject is clear. It's about India's population overtaking China's. But look at how it's been depicted. India is the overcrowded train with people hanging outside the compartment. And China? China is a sophisticated bullet train. It's falling behind, but it appears unbothered. Just like the subject, the message is also clear. China is economically advanced while India is backward. Many people on the internet have called this cartoon racist, and we agree. The India of 2023 is not about run-down trains with people on the roof. It's about modern, sustainable machines. Some, like the Vande Bharat, can rival European trains. But why care about the facts? Why bother with accuracy when you can peddle prejudice? One Twitter user laid out the numbers. In Germany, only 61% of train routes are electric. Guess how much it is in India? 85%. In fact, Germany's target for 2030 is only 75%. But like I said, why care about the facts? Cartoons are supposed to be subtle yet accurate. This one is neither. It's a crass attempt at peddling old and racist ideas about India. Remember the snake charmer stereotype? Well, this is no different. And the Western media keeps doing it again and again. Let me show you another cartoon from 2014. It's from a repeat offender, the New York Times. This was around the time India had completed its mission to Mars. Look at how the NYT depicted it. A man with a cow knocking on a door. Inside the building, it says Elite Space Club. That cartoon also triggered a lot of outrage. The New York Times ended up apologizing. But what's the point? Years later, Western attitude has not changed. It was a man with a cow in 2014. It's an overcrowded train today. The fact is, such stereotypes attract eyeballs. They showcase India as some exotic basket case. And that's one part of the problem. The second part is this. These cartoons reflect a denial of sorts. The West simply cannot accept India's growth story. How can a former colony with 1.4 billion people do what Britain or Germany does? And that too with hostile neighbors. That too without Western help. How can India do it? The idea is unacceptable for Western journalists and publishers. Hence these cartoons. India's Union Minister Rajiv Chandrasekhar has reacted sharply to this depiction. He said it's not wise to bet against India. He's also said that India's economy would soon be bigger than Germany's. Now, I know what some people will say. Why bother responding to such cartoons? Why not ignore them altogether? Well, I'll tell you why. Because this is how perceptions build. Imagine you're an ordinary German sitting in Berlin or Munich. You see this cartoon. What's your first thought? That China is some tech wonderland, while India is a poor country with crumbling infrastructure. Do you see the problem here? You expect this sort of propaganda from China's state media, in fact, even from the Chinese government. Last week, they were asked about India overtaking China's population. Do you know what the reply was? It's about quality, not quantity, they said. If you could convert those words into a cartoon, it would look like this one, the same one that Der Spiegel published. You see, China is working overtime to change the narrative around this news. They have two objectives here. One is to hide their own demographic slowdown, their aging population. The second is to discredit India's rise. And unfortunately, the West has fallen for it. Let's face it, this is not just about India versus China. It's about two different approaches to economic development and growth. India represents democracy. It shows that democracy may be slow, but it can deliver. China, meanwhile, represents autocracy. It sacrifices its freedom for growth. The question is, which one would you prefer? I know what the 2 million Uyghurs in China's labor camps will say. I also know what 7 million Tibetans will say, and the ethnic Mongols and the ethnic Kazakhs. China's growth is built on the grave of freedoms and human rights. Is that the sort of growth Western magazines want to applaud? And if so, it's their editorial call, but at least represent the truth about India. Don't peddle racism to sell your copies. Meanwhile, China's ailing banking sector is back in the news. Last month, 2 banks in the US collapsed. It snowballed into a global crisis. Depositors lost access to their money, at least temporarily. One major European bank had to be sold. Credit Suisse was bought by its rival UBS. There was widespread panic, and it seems that crisis is not over yet. The next in line could be Chinese banks, because China's banking sector remains vulnerable. According to some assessments, they're doing worse than their Western counterparts. The crisis began last year. You may remember this. There were multiple bank runs in China. As many as 5 banks had collapsed. 4 were in Henan and 1 was in the eastern province of Anhui. Going by one estimate, at least 400,000 customers were affected. Their deposits were frozen. More than 1 year has passed. Many depositors say they still haven't got their money back. Now, we don't have a number, but reports say it runs into thousands, meaning thousands of people still have not got their deposits in China, and recently some of them dared to protest. They took to the streets and they demanded their money. Now, we're not sure if they got it, but we do hope that the protesters are safe, because China does not take kindly to such actions. Last year, when some depositors protested, the state cracked down hard on them. Cops and thugs turned up in plain clothes. They beat up the protesters. More than 200 arrests were made. For what crime? These people just want their hard-earned money back, but the Chinese state is punishing them for asking. What does the law say? If a bank fails in China, the depositors are entitled to a basic payment, a payment of up to 500,000 yuan, that's 73,000 US dollars. That's the bare minimum every depositor is entitled to get. If they had less in deposits, they will be made whole. If they had more, they should get at least $73,000 at the very least. But that's only on paper, it seems. In practice, they're not getting any money. And the reason is this. The banks that failed last year had risky assets. They took money from depositors and gambled with it. Now, those risky assets have collapsed, so the banks have collapsed, and the people have nowhere to go. What's worse, the crisis is getting bigger. China fears that more banks could meet the same fate. There are around 4,000 such lenders. They hold about 25% of China's banking industry assets. When you look closely at these banks, many red flags pop up. Their ownership structure is opaque. Experts say these banks are vulnerable to corruption. They may not be able to withstand adverse events like an economic slowdown. So the smaller banks are on shaky ground. What about the bigger players? Well, they're not immune either, we are told. China's big banks are vulnerable too. In January, a report had come out. It was about Chinese banks that are quote-unquote too big to fail. Apparently, they have a $550 billion hole. I'm talking about the 4 biggest banks in China: the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the China Construction Bank Corp, the Agricultural Bank of China, and the Bank of China. They're said to be precariously poised. Their ability to cushion a loss is being questioned. Reports say these banks need $550 billion more to manage any potential losses. They're being forced to make some tough calls, like selling bonds to make up for the funding gap. And this was the situation in the month of January. We are now in the month of April, and China's banking sector is still showing signs of stress. Where and in what form will it end? We'll be tracking. Some things are inevitable in our world, like taxes, death, and military coups in Pakistan. Well, jokes aside, there is actual talk of a military takeover. The claim has come from Shahid Khaqan Abbasi. He's a former prime minister and senior leader of the ruling party. So he's a bigwig, not some political lightweight in Islamabad. And let me quote what Abbasi said. Pakistan has had many long periods of martial law in very similar situations. In fact, I would say Pakistan has never witnessed a more severe economic and political situation before. In much less severe circumstances, the military has taken over. That was a former prime minister. He might as well have laid a red carpet for the generals. I mean, it's an open invitation. The question is, what explains it? Shahid Abbasi is blaming institutional failure for this. Let me quote him again. Military takeovers have happened in many countries. When the political and constitutional system fails, extra constitutional measures take place. How about that for democracy? A former prime minister is openly defending military coups. Abbasi's statement is a reflection of the systemic rot in Pakistan. You will never hear such a statement in a real democracy. It tells you how far Pakistan has fallen. For now, let's focus on Abbasi's invitation/statement. How likely is a military coup in Islamabad? Abbasi is right about one thing. Pakistan's economic and political woes have peaked. Forex reserves are down to $4 billion. To put that figure in perspective, India has more than $586 billion. Pakistan has 4. Inflation is at 47%. Projected growth, 0.5%. And around 16% of all graduates are jobless. Politically, things are even worse. The government of Shehbaz Sharif is deeply unpopular. They are under constant pressure from Imran Khan and the PTI. And what's worse, October is election time, so the army has 2 options. One is to rig the elections to keep Imran Khan out, but it may work, may not work, or a backlash could spiral out of control. The second is to stay out and risk an Imran victory, which is unlikely. Looking at the army's history, there is a third option, of course, the nuclear option. Scrap the elections and take power themselves. It is by no means unprecedented. Pakistan has spent half of its lifetime under military rule. There have been 3 successful coups in 75 years. So another one is not impossible. Far from it. Having said that, 2023 is not 1958 or 1977 or 1999, which is when the coups happened. The times have changed. For starters, there is a new army chief in Rawalpindi, General Asim Munir. He took charge in November last year, November 2022. Will he be confident enough to unseat the civilian government so early in his term? Does he have the unquestionable loyalty of his men? That's gamble number 1. Gamble number 2 is the domestic reaction. In the past, Pakistan's elite had supported military takeovers. I'm talking about businessmen and even journalists. Will they do it again? Like I said, it's a gamble. Number 3 is the foreign reaction. You see, the dictatorships in 1977 and 1999 enjoyed American support, and both times the reason was the same, Afghanistan. But this time around, the Americans may not play ball. They have no stake in Afghanistan anymore. Plus, they have a strategic partnership with Pakistan's chief rival, that is India. It wasn't the case in the last century. These factors will influence the decision of the generals in Pakistan. A successful coup may resolve the political bickering. It may also provide some policy direction, but a failed coup would be a deadly blow to the Pakistani army. It may destroy their aura of invincibility in Pakistani politics. The bottom line is this: while it's possible for the army to take power, it's not probable. If General Munir decides to go maverick, then all bets are off, of course. But as things stand, it looks unlikely. India too will be watching the events in Islamabad closely. A military coup in a nuclear-armed rogue neighbor is never good news. The only option is to prepare for the worst. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. These 5 countries are together called Brics. It's a grouping, and this group may soon disrupt the global power structure. It's expanding. As many as 19 countries want to join the Brics, and this is very significant. In a divided world, this group may emerge as a force to reckon with. You may think, how does yet another group help? And why should you care? Well, tonight we'll discuss why. In about 2 months from now, the BRICS summit will be held. South Africa is the host, and one of the agenda items is the expansion of BRICS. Like I said, 19 countries want to join. A South African diplomat has shared the details. Let me quote from what he said. What will be discussed is the expansion of BRICS and the modalities of how this will happen. 13 countries have formally asked to join, and another 6 have asked informally. We are getting applications to join every day. Which countries are these? We don't have the full list, but we do know of 2 countries that have formally asked to join. These are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And among those interested are Argentina, the UAE, Algeria, Egypt, Bahrain and Indonesia. They all want to join BRICS. The question is why? These countries already have multiple platforms to engage. They have bilateral engagements where leaders have one-on-one meetings. They have multilateral engagements like the G20 or Group of 20 top economies, or the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and of course the United Nations. So multiple avenues to engage. Then why bother with the BRICS? Because our world is changing. Globalization as we know it is ending. The pandemic disrupted it, and the Ukraine war accelerated its end. It has left our world divided into 2 blocks, one led by the US and its Western allies, and the other led by China and Russia. Where does it leave countries that don't want to join either camp? Countries that still want to enjoy the perks of globalization without picking sides. And there are more such countries than you would imagine. They don't want to pay the price for a great power game. Look at this map. How many countries are in the Western camp? 52. They criticize Russia. They have sanctioned Moscow for the war in Ukraine. What about the other side, the Russia-China-led camp? It has 12 members, just 12. What about the rest? There are some 127 states that fall in neither camp, 127 countries who have neither supported Russia nor criticized the NATO. They did not join the sanctions against Russia. These non-aligned nations are the majority, and they have a clear agenda now. They're being both pragmatic and opportunistic, and they want a forum to present their case. Brics could be that forum, although it does have Russia and China as members, but they've so far not been allowed to hijack the agenda. This forum has advocated for globalization to be kept intact, and it has several compelling proposals in the pipeline. There is talk of a Brics currency. It may not happen immediately, but it's an interesting proposal. It's a proposal to bypass the US dollar in international trade. Brics members are also building new trade routes. One of them is the International North-South Transportation Corridor. It could speed up movement of cargo from Russia to countries like India. And proposals like these are attracting the non-aligned states. They want mechanisms that are largely insulated from the great power rivalry. Brics provides them an option. This may have given the group a new purpose, saving globalization. Politicians are thin-skinned. It's an open secret in most countries. They hate any sort of criticism. But for a long time, they had no option but to hear it. You couldn't just jail every single critic or block their voice out. But with social media, most criticism has shifted online. It has also become a lot more personal and toxic. People don't just attack policies, they also attack a public official's identity, even their family. As they say in boxing, cheap shots. Social media platforms do have an answer for this problem. It's called the block button. If someone is personally attacking you, just block them. But as always, some public officials use it for the wrong reasons. Don't like an opinion? Block the user. Don't agree with the criticism? Block. Not interested in a complaint? Well, block away. It's an easy way out for public officials. The question is, should they have this power? Should they have the power to block people? The US Supreme Court is debating this question. It is hearing two different cases, both related to blocking users. I'll give you a quick rundown. The court will decide if blocking users is a violation of the First Amendment of the US Constitution. Now, what does the First Amendment talk about? Freedom of speech, among other things. And this promises to be an interesting legal debate. There are multiple questions to answer. Number one, is blocking someone the same as muzzling them? Because a block is not like a ban. Your tweets or posts only become unavailable to that person, not to the entire platform. Number two, does social media activity count as government work? If it does, then blocking is dangerous. If not, it could be considered a personal action. It's one of those confusing debates. On the one hand, toxicity and hate are real problems. So is a leader crushing dissent. Let me tell you about a study conducted in Germany. It found that 54% of all German mayors had experienced online hate. More than half of them ignored it. 5% of them blocked the user, and 8% filed a judicial complaint. So in most cases, public officials just take it on the chin. But there is a disproportionate impact. Women and minority leaders face more hate online. Sometimes it forces them to quit their job. Let me introduce you to Kia Morris. She was the only African-American lawmaker in the US state of Vermont, but in 2018 she stepped down. The reason? A wave of online and offline hatred. Another example is Nikki Morgan. She was a cabinet minister in the UK, but in 2019 she did not stand for re-election. The reason? Online abuse, among others. The situation in the UK is so bad that women's organizations have raised an alarm. They say female lawmakers are retiring much earlier, a major reason being the barrage of abuse and hate. A third example is Lisa van Ginneken. She's the first transgender MP in the Netherlands, but in 2022 she announced she is leaving Twitter. The reason? Online hate. For such officials and leaders, the block button is important. not for crushing dissent, but for their mental peace and sanity. Having said that, there is another side to this debate, and that side is leaders like Donald Trump. He is said to have blocked hundreds of users on Twitter, from journalists to writers to comedians. In fact, his blocking spree became a legal case. A federal judge in the US ordered Trump to unblock multiple accounts. The judge said it is a violation of the First Amendment. Trump did move the Supreme Court, but by then he was out of office. Now, the US Supreme Court has another shot at the case. Their decision could set a template elsewhere, because online hate is a problem in most countries. I think we can all agree that politicians will never stop using social media. I think we can also agree that social media will never become 100% hate-free. So what's the solution? The bare minimum should be guidelines. Yes, politicians have signed up for a career of criticism, but stick to policies. Don't drag in their family or their race or their gender into it. Now let's come to a pertinent question of our times. What is war good for? Is it good for absolutely nothing? Or does it help business? The results are in, and as expected, one business is having a stellar year: the global military-industrial complex. The latest numbers are out. World military expenditure has reached a record high. It has reached $2,240 billion, or more than $2.2 trillion. Last year's growth is fueled mostly by Europe, which is expected, of course, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The war has shaken off the years of military complacency in Europe and started a global arms race all over again. Our next report brings you the details.
The war in Ukraine was bound to impact global military spending. It's the biggest conflict in mainland Europe since the Second World War, and it has alarmed European nations. Global military spending has gone up by 3.7%. In Europe, there's a jump of 13%, and the top spenders are countries close to Russia. Finland increased military expenditure by 36%, Lithuania by 27%, Sweden 12%, Poland 11%. Of course, the biggest spender was Ukraine. Its military expenditure shot up by a whopping 640%. In 2022, Ukraine spent over $44 billion on defense. What about Russia? It spent $86.4 billion. That's a rise of over 9% from the previous year. It seems like a modest rise, but given the fact that Russia was the world's third largest military spender anyway, the 9% bump is significant. Overall, almost every part of the world saw higher spending on arms. Leading the way, as always, was the US. Its military expenses totaled $877 billion in 2022. Remember, the global total is about $2.2 trillion. So Washington is single-handedly responsible for 39% of total global military spending. And while some of that was for arms to Ukraine, the majority was still for US defense purposes. America spent about 1.5 times what all of Asia and Oceania did on defense last year. And remember, Asia houses the second largest military spender in the world, China. China's military spending grew by 4.2%. to about $292 billion. It's nowhere close to the US in terms of spending, but far beyond other nations. This is bad news for overall global stability. An arms race between rival powers that eclipses all others. It has very Cold War vibes to it. The fourth biggest military spender in the world is India. New Delhi spent $81.4 billion on arms. It's part of the recent trend of India's greater military focus. Number 5 on the global list is Saudi Arabia. The Gulf Kingdom increased military spending by 16%. It's Riyadh's first increase since 2018. Last year, Saudi Arabia spent a total of $75 billion on its military. It's not all gloom and impending doom, though. There were some exceptions to the global trend. Like Turkey and Nigeria, Nigeria's military spending fell by 38%. But this is just compared to 2021. That year saw Nigeria increase its spending tremendously, so it's more of an adjustment than a proper decrease. Turkey, however, saw military spending go down for the third year in a row. It's down 26% compared to 2021. But that's also expected due to the terrible economic condition of the country. It's been facing a crisis since 2018, and last year it saw more than 50% inflation. So it's not surprising that its military expenses have been falling for a while. Overall, the outlook for peace looks bleak. The war in Ukraine is likely to spur military spending for years to come. So will the rivalry between the US and China. Every nation will try and arm itself to the teeth, and it leaves the world more unstable. Like always, the only ones who will benefit are arms companies.
For our next story, let's talk about romance. It's delightful, something worth savoring. We did a quick Google search on romantic quotes, and here's what came up. You complete me. I wish I knew how to quit you. You don't get to choose if you get hurt in this world, but you do have a say in who hurts you. Now, we can say these lines to someone we love, but do you know what else makes us feel this way? French fries. Seriously, for most of us, they're truly the love of our life. They lift our mood when we're feeling down. They make us happy, and they make our happy moments happier. But this love, too, is not without its problems. A new study says we are in a toxic relationship with fries. They're giving us anxiety and depression. Does this red flag call for a breakup? Our next report explores. When someone says exercise, all we hear is extra fries. Because French fries are not just a vastly nurtured starter, they are a comfort food with their greasy golden goodness and heavily salted heavenly crisp. They're so well loved that they have their own day, July the 13th. Americans eat 30 billion pounds of fries each year, and they are the national dish of Belgium. But hey, maybe it's time to put them down and walk away slowly, because this comfort food may be out to get us. A new study is out. It links fries with something particularly frightening. Pardon the pun. French fries may be bad for our mental health, it says. Research says fried food is linked to depression and anxiety. In terms of data, it increases the risk of anxiety by 12% and the risk of depression by 7%. This is especially true for fried potato, like French fries. But take this study with a pinch of salt. It's only in the preliminary stage, and its causality is in question. For example, are fried foods driving anxiety and depression, or do people with symptoms of mental health issues turn to fried food? The study has not answered this question yet. And this is not the first time research has pointed to the health downsides of French fries. Another study came out in 2017. It said French fries increase the risk of death. But this again was an association, and the internet was up in arms about it, deeply hurt that someone had dared raise a finger at their beloved fries. That being said, it's not a surprise that fried food is not good for us. Reaching this conclusion is not rocket science. For the sake of an example, let's stick with fries. They're made of potatoes, which are vegetables, sure, but they do not rank well on the health scale. Experts call them starch bombs. If you take a potato, remove its skin, cut it, and deep fry it in oil, then add salt, spices, and cheese, the situation becomes much worse, giving them high levels of trans fat and sodium. But apart from this, something else is just as obvious. Eating well is important for mental health. Studies say unhealthy food leads to fatigue and even impairs decision-making. Depending on the frequency of consumption, it may cause stress and depression. Junk food is processed and high in sugar. This leads to inflammation of the body and brain. This can contribute to mood disorders, so it helps to consume it lesser, especially as mental health issues are on the rise worldwide. About 5% people suffer from depression, more than 4% live with anxiety. So is it time to completely give up on fried food? Well, experts say not really. Sometimes eating unhealthy food boosts our mood. So when we do eat it, portion control is key. A well-balanced diet is important, and elimination is not the only option. Because French fries may be bad for us, but they do taste good. And when you do eat them, here's a friendly tip. Fries go great with a salad. Enjoy. Now let's turn our attention to Europe. It braved a particularly dry summer last year and Spain was hit hard. Now its drought has prolonged and the lack of rain in Spain is causing culinary pain. After all, it's the largest olive oil producer. Spain produces half of the world's olive oil, but now it is witnessing lower crop yields. So there's a slump in oil production and prices of olive oil have been pushed to record levels. They've surged almost 60% since last June. Can the production rebound this year? Here's a report.
Europe suffered a blistering summer last year. This caused a severe drought, the continent's worst in 500 years.
2022 was the second warmest year on record, the warmest summer on record. We saw prolonged and extensive heat waves and also prolonged and extensive drought over much of the continent.
The drought ravaged crops across Europe, including corn in Romania, beans in Belgium, rice in Italy, and garlic in France. But among the hardest hit were the olives in Spain, because Spain suffered a massive drought, heat waves, and wildfires.
Conditions are as bad as they can be. There are droughts and a lot of wind, which is even worse because it doesn't let you control the fire.
We had never imagined that something like this could happen. I had heard about other wildfires, but this is amazing. I'm really anguished.
Now, 4 months into the new year, Spain's problems are far from over. It's still struggling with the prolonged drought, and the crop yield continues to deplete. Production of the green gold is in danger. This is deeply problematic. Spain is the largest producer of olive oil in the world, responsible for half of the world's production. But now this production has halved in the last 12 months. It's now 780,000 tons. And you can guess what this is doing to the world's olive oil. Prices are soaring, hitting record levels. They've increased by about 60% in less than a year. This begs the question, is the situation set to improve this year? Experts are doubtful. There is a clear lack of rain, and Spain is only getting hotter. Last month was its second warmest March this century. It was also the second driest. And April is set to be the driest on record. This is unusually dry weather for Spain. So in short, production is not likely to rebound this year, and it could keep prices of olive oil elevated. The situation is grim. To give you an idea, people are now stealing olive oil, especially the high-quality ones, which is only logical. If you're going to steal something, you may as well get the good stuff. Last month, the Spanish police seized 6,000 litres of stolen olive oil and 17,500 kgs of stolen olives. 16 people were arrested. While some are trying to steal olive oil, others around the world are shifting their preference to other cooking oils, like sunflower oil, which has also taken a hit. The war in Ukraine pushed up the costs. Ukraine was previously the world's top exporter of sunflower oil. Regardless, the lower olive harvest continues to hurt Spain. Spain loves its olives. It's home to 4th or 5th generation farmers. Their holdings go back to about 100 years. For Spain, its olives make people burst with pride. So the harvest may not just be a business to them. Also, Spain is a one-crop economy and its people are losing money. Experts say the record-breaking temperatures will only get worse, and the country's current model of water management is unsustainable. So its people continue to brave the brunt of climate change. And while the olive oil capital of the world is parched, there is still no rain forecast.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Italian Coast Guard has released dramatic footage of a migrant rescue operation. Migrants can be seen desperately trying to be rescued after their boat sank. In Spain, police tried to catch hold of suspected drug dealers. This high-speed chase looks right out of an action movie. In Peru, a 1,000-year-old mummy has been found. It has some skin and hair intact. Scientists believe it was an adolescent. A movie theater in the US had an unanticipated visitor, a moose. It helped itself to some popcorn and casually left. In New Zealand, Aurora Australis lit up the sky over Christchurch. And finally, what makes April the 25th significant? We are taking you back in history. On this day, construction of the Suez Canal began. The year was 1859. The idea was discussed in the 1830s. There was a need for a larger canal, providing a direct route between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. The construction took 10 years. More than 1 million people worked on the project. It is believed that tens of thousands of workers even died due to cholera and other factors. The project was 4 years behind schedule. It was finally completed in 1869. This man-made waterway cuts through Egypt and is very important to world trade, so much so that world powers have fought over it. Today, it is one of the world's busiest maritime trade routes. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Come on. Give me your hand. Okay, keep on, okay? Keep on, okay, my hand. Left side, okay? Keep on. Come on!
Exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. the US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.